Everyone. Good evening, good evening, good evening. Sorry about the delay there. Hello, hello, hello. My apologies. We had a slight miscommunication with Ehren about timings, and he was going to be ready at 8 o'clock our time. Anyway, he's just jumped off the off a pick. He's been picking all night long. It's 11 o'clock their time, not 12 o'clock as I thought. But we are delighted that you could all join, and delighted that, most importantly, Ehren could join straight from, it looks like the edge of a vineyard.
Oh yeah.
Ehren, so great to see you. As I just mentioned this morning, at Flint Stannary HQ in London, we had a terrific tasting, another Zoom tasting with Laure Colombo, daughter of Jean-Luc Colombo. This is a new agency for Stannary. She's based in Saint-Péray, makes beautiful Saint-Péray and Cornas. But the link here is that you, well, take you about 30 years, you spent several years working with her father.
I did, yeah. And funny story. So Laura actually visited me a few years ago, and I was sitting. It was during. I can't remember exactly the time of the year, but I remember watching this woman walk up to the crush pad, and I thought, man, she looks so familiar. But she was 8 when I worked there, and now she's in her mid-30s. So she's awesome. I know the wines. I think the world of her, obviously her dad and mom, and it's great to know that she's well looked after in the UK. So well, funny word. The wine business is a very small world.
Indeed, she only has a couple of hectares, but we're excited to be importing her wines. But so you worked with her father as a young man, clearly.
I did, yeah. I was there the harvest. Well, I'm coming up on 30 years ago. It would have been the harvest of 92. Is that right? 90, 91. Yeah, harvest of 92, harvest of 93. So yeah, almost seems like it was yesterday. Yeah, I had a life-altering experience working there. It was transformational on many levels. So I owe her family a great debt. And in fact, we were just chatting internally amongst our family about the fact that we need to get over there to see everyone because it's been a while. So yeah, it's I enjoyed 2. Well, 92 was a relatively good harvest in the Northern Rhone, although it was sort of the letdown year after 88, 89, 90, and 91. And in hindsight, it was actually quite good. And then there was 93, which was I have many friends here who said, oh, it's too bad you had to see that. And I said, no, actually, it was fascinating to see a very rainy harvest because we don't really get those in California. And so anytime it does rain here and people run around like chickens with their heads cut off, I just sort of think back and say, this isn't rain. 93 in the Northern Rhone, that was rain.
And when you were living in the Northern Rhone, did you do any trips up to Burgundy?
Oh, many. Yeah, sure. I traveled relatively extensively. By strange happenstance, the gentleman who had been my boss at the job that I left in California, which was working at Joseph Phelps Vineyards, just prior to my departure, he left and went to work for a French wine importer in the States by the name of Kermit Lynch. And so for a decade, including the 2 years that I worked in the Northern Rhone, I accompanied him on a 2-week trip to visit all of Kermit's the wineries that Kermit imported into the States. So that was a pretty exhaustive list of some pretty great producers. So I did spend a fair bit of time in Burgundy as a result of that, not to mention other trips with friends working at other wineries and but spent a lot of time in Champagne and Alsace and the Southern Rhone and the Loire and all over the joint. The Arrow and Languedoc, all that. I'm pretty well versed. I mean, we occasionally talk about we should sell everything in California and buy a place in France. And then of course I wake up and say, nah, I think I'll just stay here. So it's
Kermit is a legendary figure, and if anyone hasn't read Adventures on a Wine Route,
yeah,
that's one of the great wine books.
Yeah, it was a great entree into some domains that are very, very difficult to get into. I mean, I've had probably 10 tastings at Cocherie, which was, relatively high up on the list. And then Kermit, of course, imports Aubert de Valence wines, not the Romani Conti wines, but Aubert was always kind enough to, on top of the tasting at A&P de Valence, we would usually do a tasting at Romani Conti as well. So that was kind of him, and we got to try a lot of good wines. So not to mention Chevion, and I mean he's got a great list of Burgundy producers. So and
that started your love with Pinot and Chardonnay and tasting those wines.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, I sort of had this vision of what I wanted to do, and I mean, I still make Syrah, Gros Syrah. The reality in the U.S. and where I live, I think is it's a Chardonnay and Pinot Noir are pretty. I'm still not 100% convinced that they're the 100% best thing to grow in every single spot in this part of the world, which is why I experiment with things like Chenin Blanc and Trousseau and Pulsard, and but they're a pretty good thing to grow here. So I kind of keep clarity on the Chardonnay and Pinot Noir front and sort of the engine that runs the bus, if you will. But I also do enjoy dabbling in other things. So sorry, if my call was interrupted there. So that was certainly a beginning. My trips to Burgundy weren't my exposure to Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, but they were certainly my exposure to making really good Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And the joke always was, so Bruce didn't speak French, and we would leave these domains, and on the way out, the proprietor would always look at me and say in French, "Bruce asks the most technical of questions." And I would say, yes, well, Bruce is very interested in the very minutia, the details of how exactly you make your wines. It makes it easier for him to sell. And Bruce would turn to me as we walked out and in English say, "What were you guys talking about?"
Of course, you were translator.
I was the translator. I got to really pick their brains about exactly what they were doing. And they were, uncharacteristically forthcoming because I was merely the translator for their agent. Now, that being said, years later, many of their children came to work for Bruce and myself. I was his partner in a eponymous winery here in California. And 10 and 12 years later, I had people saying, "I always thought you might have been involved in production when you were asking me all those questions. And now I know what you were doing." And I said, "Yes, I was getting my master's degree in viticulture and winemaking, thanks to you. So thank you so much."
So you came back from trips to France and founded Failla at the end of the 90s.
Yes, first vintage of Failla was 1998. Came back from France to actually be a partner with this fellow Bruce Nyers and his wife in a winery called Nyers. And then we all had our day jobs. Bruce obviously worked for Kermit. His wife actually worked for a celebrated chef in Berkeley, a woman named Alice Waters, who has a restaurant called Chez Panisse in Berkeley. And Bruce's wife was a chef, but then went on to help ghostwrite a lot of cookbooks. And then I had to get a day job because this was sort of a back of the bar napkin business. And my day job ended up being working for a couple by the name, her name is Helen Turley. His name is John Wetlaufer. They had a very small micro brand called Marcassin, with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir out on the Sonoma coast. And that relationship led to an introduction to her brother, Larry Turley, who had a Zinfandel winery. And I ended up jumping ships and I went to work for Larry and ended up working for him for about 20 years. The first 10 vintages of Failla were actually made at the Turley Winery prior to my acquiring a piece of property and building the winery that we now occupy. So yeah, it was it's been a long road. It's a lot of fun. We were picking this morning, and my 4-year-old son was we planted this Pulsar Trousseau Gamay block in 2016. He was born in 2017. So we had a small crop in 2018. So we were joking that he's harvested every crop that's come off this block, and he's getting better at it. Before, a few years ago, it was one cut and a cluster and and diapers and running back to the house. And this year he actually got up and picked with us until we were done at age 4 and small change. So he's going to grow up in the business. And I didn't. I actually grew up in a steel town. I grew up in the Newcastle of the United States, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I had a much more circuitous path. He'll have a much more direct shot at it, much like Lore, Colombo. So yeah.
And we are tasting now the Haynes Vineyard,
which we picked this morning, by the way. In my notes, I thought you might be doing the Platt, but you're doing Haynes. So we picked Haynes this morning. We had 4 picks going on last night. So in California, we tend to, the sort of idyllic European vision of grape picking by day. We don't really do that very much. We pretty much pick at night because it's cold at night here. And if you pick all night, you can get fruit to the winery early, so you can get it all processed and in fermenters or pressed and in barrels by the end of the day. While it's hard on the picking crews, they prefer it because the bees are all in bed. It's cold out, and it's just much easier picking. And the trucking's easier because you're trucking at early hours in the morning. So
and how long have you been picking at Haynes? How long has that relationship been going for?
Oh boy, so I got to think about it. I want to say a decade at least. The property actually changed hands 2.5 years ago. The longtime owner, a woman named Pat Haynes, whose husband was directly related to Nathan Coombs, who was one of the founding fathers of the Napa Valley. In fact, the AVA is Coombsville, which was named after him. It had been in the family for generations, and she put it up for sale. It was a bit of a lofty price tag, so I certainly was aware of it, but was not in my price range, let's say. It was purchased by a gentleman by the name of Galen Lawrence, who has been buying up a couple of wineries in the Napa Valley. He acquired Heights, was his first purchase. He's since purchased Burgess and Stony Hill. He bought the Haynes Vineyard, which has a winery on it. But they're still selling me grapes. So it's a wonderful site. So I sort of had to think about how long we've been actually getting grapes, because I have to separate that from how long I've been coveting the grapes. And I say that because the vineyard's 52 years old, which is pretty rare for Chardonnay in the United States. I used to say I can count on one hand the number of vineyards. I knew of 5 that were at least 50 years old, and one of them got torn out, so we're down to 4 now. They're just not that many. I mean, Chardonnay was not a la mode in the early 60s and mid 60s in California. We were much more intrigued by making wines that bore the name of some famous place in Europe. So someone might bottle Chablis but it wasn't Chardonnay. So thank you to the great marketing savvy of many U.S. vintners in that time frame. So there wasn't a lot of Chardonnay planted, and so it is a rarity to have these old vines. It's a part of the Napa Valley, Coombsville, is that people don't think much about. I would say of late it has come on because of the soil makeup and how cool the site is. And I know it from, I knew of it on two fronts. I knew of the vineyard because years ago, there's a fellow by the name of John Kongsgaard who has a winery here called Kongsgaard. But before he started his winery, he was the winemaker at Newton Vineyards, Peter Newton. And they made a wine called the Newton Unfiltered Chardonnay that just sort of, to me, was about the best thing Chardonnay wise I'd tasted in the States. And it was predominantly from the Haynes Vineyard, which I, of course, was like, okay, this is a great wine, but where's it from? And so it had been on my radar for some time. And when Newton sold to, I want to say LVMH, I called them. I thought, well, as long as it's a family-owned business, they're probably unlikely to change. And as soon as I found out about the sale, knowing what I know about large multinational conglomerates and the way they enter the wine space, I called the woman that owned it, Pat Haynes, and said, I'd love to buy some Chardonnay. And she, of course, said, well, I'm under contract and everything's great and blah, blah, blah. And I said, oh, totally understood. If anything were to change, here's my phone number. And sure enough, a year later, I get a phone call saying, would you like 10 tons of Chardonnay? So funny, it's when you do this long enough, you can just watch things happen and say, oh, I know what's coming here. So
would you be getting the same plot every year?
Yes. Yeah. Same vine, same rows, same everything. Yeah. So it's this part of the valley. From my days at Turley, we actually had a Zinfandel vineyard that was, a couple miles away, but still part of Coombsville. And it was the last vineyard we picked every year, i.e. Coombsville is the coldest spot in the Napa Valley. And I would say it's fascinatingly cold, and not that I can necessarily explain it, because for instance, the Hudson Vineyard, which I also get Chardonnay from, which is about 6.5 miles south and west, will frequently pick 4 to 6 weeks. It's a long time, 4 to 6 weeks ahead of the Haynes Vineyard. And so it's just this cold little pocket in a otherwise, relatively warm spot. And I think part of it is vine age and scion material. We live in the land of clones now, but of course in the mid 60s, you couldn't go to your local neighborhood nursery and say, I want clone 95 and clone blah, blah. There weren't any. So this was all a Massal selection of wood that the Wente family brought in from Burgundy in the 1800s. So these little tiny clusters, and it's just, it's the kind of thing that I frequently say to people today, if you want old vine Chardonnay in the future, you should look at how these vineyards are planted, because I don't believe that we, as the modern viticulturalists in California, are actually looking at that and saying, is the thing we're planting today going to be here in 50 or 60 or 70 or 80 years? So, rootstocks, we've become much more dependent on irrigation. The Haynes Vineyard is dry farmed. It's got it's on a very water scavenging rootstock, which was sort of the exclusive rootstock of California in the from phylloxera up until about the early 1970s. There was one rootstock that was planted here. If you didn't own root your vineyard, it was St. George, which is a very vigorous rootstock. So they tended to be planted further apart. And, now it's very much a la mode to plant very densely in these devigorating rootstocks, but they need water. And, of course, we're in a pretty severe drought right now. So suddenly these old vineyards look really smart, like someone knew what they were doing. So,
and Ehren, how was 2019 in Napa and also in Sonoma?
Oh, it was a lovely vintage. It was a little bit warmer than 18. 18 was sort of abnormally cool. 18 being one of probably my single favorite years of all time, but maybe slightly more unrecognizable to regular drinkers of California wine because it was so cool. 19 was a hair warmer. I would still put it on the cooler side of the last 10 vintages. Certainly not a torrid heat bomb, and a handsome crop. Again, slightly smaller than 18, but certainly in the above average volumetrically. So we get into these. I call them the Goldilocks vintages. Not too hot, not too cold, not too not too shy, not too overcropped. Sorry, I live near an airport, so if you hear the plane, and if I'll apologize in advance for screaming children, because I do have an 18-month-old and a 4-year-old that are marauding around. Anytime I do these videos, I have, usually the dogs are arrayed behind me. I now have dogs and cats, although they just took off after some bird or something. So, and children. So it's, I am shooting from my house. I'm just actually standing next to a big wall of bins in front of my barn and my forklift, and my wife's garden is out behind us. And my vineyards are kind of this way and this way. So, yeah. Anyway, it's a lovely day here. We've enjoyed quite a cool August after a relatively early start to the growing season, and we're as I'm on some level sure you've read by now, we're experiencing a deficit of rainfall. Although in this part of the world, I would say we're less affected, only because we don't have radically hot days. So our harvest has been, 2021 has been relatively normal. And I was speaking to a friend the other day, and I just sort of smiled. I said, it's so great. And they said, oh, the quality is fantastic. And I said, no, just the fact that we're not picking grapes in a fire is fantastic. Yeah. Like quality, I'm sure it'll be fine. I'm just like, after last year, because last year, of course, we had some pretty epic fires right in our back pocket here. But going back to 19 was it was quite a lovely vintage. Like I said, I would put it in the edging toward more classically Californian compared to 18, but still with plenty of underlying acidity. Maybe a note more heft on the wines. I just looked back before we got on the call at our harvest dates, and latter part of September for Haynes. Savoy came in, I think it was the 17th of August. Of September. And to correlate that to this year, so we picked Haynes last night. That being said, the yields there were abysmally small, which that does happen. And the same in the Anderson Valley. We're actually picking Savoy. Today is Tuesday. We're picking Savoy tonight. So that would be 10 or 12 days before. What is today? The 8th. I'm sorry, I lose track of the day and the date. Yeah. But we're a week to 10 days earlier this year. The Anderson Valley has been, and this is speaking about Savoy, which is Anderson Valley, so southern part of Mendocino County. That part of the world has been more extremely affected by the drought. The town of Mendocino, which is it's not in the Anderson Valley, but it's, if you the Anderson Valley runs from southeast to northwest, and after you exit the valley, in short order, you're on the coast, and in the town of Mendocino, which is this sort of storybook town, they've run out of water at the town. They're trucking it in. They have a lot of shallow wells for the municipality. That being said, Savoy ran out of water. And so the vines this year are definitely stressed. It's definitely a smaller crop. I mean, the vineyard owner / management team has gone in and cut fruit off, just saying you can't, that we don't have a canopy to sustain a normal crop here. So those are the kinds of things you start to see in year 2 of a drought. So it'll be a small harvest. I mean, that this year will be small. 19. I mean, and to correlate that, I think in 19, we get 4 blocks of Savoy, and I want to say we had 11 tons. And this year we've not picked it, but I think we're probably more like 7 tons this year off the same surface area. So I mean, a pretty substantial haircut, which my wife tells me I need a substantial haircut. So we get into harvest and I keep putting them off. So hence the hat.
Ehren, I've got a couple of questions on the chat.
Sure.
First one from Ian. Going back to your mention earlier of more eclectic varietals that you're harvesting,
Yep.
is that down to intellectual curiosity, or do you think there's potential for a genuine market there? Is it a commercial decision or more curiosity?
I would say there's an element of both. I mean, I am an intellectually curious person. I like wine, period. I'm fascinated by it. I drink wines from all over the world. And I think about, well, as a for instance, and one of the initial causes of action. So the ranch that I live on, which is our Olivet ranch, when I purchased it, had just 9 acres of Chardonnay and 5 acres of Pinot Noir planted. And I planted another 4 acres of Pinot. And I should step back and say the relative mix at Failla, we're about 70% Pinot Noir, 25% Chardonnay, and then 5% other. Syrah, Chenin Blanc. Up in Oregon, we make Pinot Gris and Gruner Veltliner, Gamay. So Pinot Noir definitely is the predominant wine. And I just kept looking at this large volume of Chardonnay every year and scratching my head and saying, well, I do a single vineyard. There's a couple areas of the ranch that seem to produce the best Chardonnay, and that becomes a single vineyard wine. And then some of it goes into our Sonoma coast. And this is the purely economic side of it. And I said, well, so I'm putting it into my least expensive wine that I sell the highest percentage of on a wholesale basis, which means effectively half price. I bet you there's probably some other things I could grow here, even in small quantities, where I could sell even if it was $35 or $40 a bottle. If I sold it all direct, I'd be making a lot more money. So I began to think about that, and therein lies the collision of commerce and then me thinking about, well, what would grow well here? What would it be fun to try? What do I like to drink? Because at the end of the day, I make wines that I want to drink, and so that's where that sort of came from. It was, intellectual curiosity combined with the economic realities of the business. So we planted a small experimental block just to see where these things were. We not really commercially viable quantities. It was more just to be able to sample them through harvest and say, are we planting something that's going to get ripe at the same time? Is it going to get ripe later? And so then from there, we went on to beginning to top work. So basically we cut the head off the Chardonnay vineyard and grafted, buds of whatever flavor we wanted to move to, and which is a very laborious process. So we did a half an acre roughly of Chenin Blanc, which has been a wonderful exercise. The wines are really delicious. And then in 2019, is that right? No, 2020, we did a 1/4 acre of Sauvignon, so the white from the Jura, and then we did about 3/4 of an acre that was split up between Trousseau, Pulsard, and Gamay.
And what about? There's a question from Thomas Lemay. What about Mourvedre? Following the Kermit Lynch connection there, his love of Bandol and.
I personally love Mourvedre. I drink a lot of it. It's too cold where I am. It's just not. It would not. I mean, it's the kind of thing where you probably maybe could get it ripe 4 years out of 10.
Yeah.
My experience with Mourvedre in other areas of California just says to me, you need a bit more heat than we have here. And so I tend to think of our experimentation being with cooler climate grapes primarily. So, think of, Loire and Jura specifically.
And just focusing on this Savoy Pinot, which I've got to say is showing beautifully. I mean, there's some depth of flavor there, some spice, but also good tension to the wine. I think I'm right. This is a newish relationship with Savoy.
I think we've been. I'm going to think about when it changed hands. I want to say maybe 2012. So I mean, we're sneaking up on a decade.
Gosh.
And so, I mean, the thing with the Anderson Valley, so when this wine was made, 2019, we had one relationship in the Anderson Valley, which was with Savoy. And as I said earlier, the valley runs from the southeast to the northwest. The southeast part of the valley is the main town. As you enter the Anderson Valley, it's called Boonville. And as you go west, you're going cooler. So Boonville's the warmest part of the valley. The midpoint of the valley is a town called Failla, and that's where town's probably the wrong word. I mean, it's a wide spot in the road, and I think there's a general store. But it's sort of the mid-range of temperature, and then when you get to what people call the deep end of the valley, it's quite a bit cooler. You're much closer to the water. And so to step forward a year, in 2020, when we had the bad fires in Sonoma, I was prospecting for other grapes. And I, through some deduction and thought process, ended up in the Anderson Valley, which was not really affected by the fires in Sonoma County. And so we now have a relationship with two additional vineyards. So Savoy now, same spot, it's in the middle of the valley. We have a new, so in 2020 and then 21, we continue this relationship. Farrington is a vineyard in Boonville, and then Wendling is a vineyard out at the far end. And this isn't a big valley. It's 15 to 17 miles from one end to the other. And to give it some context, I was up sampling and we made the decision to pick at Farrington. And I want to say that was on the, sorry, my phone is reminding me that I have a Zoom with you at 12 o'clock. So we sampled all three. Well, actually we sampled two of the three, and the reason will become apparent for the third. So went to Farrington and I thought, oh, this is actually really close. We ended up picking it. I want to say it was the 4th of September. It was, 23.5 bricks. I mean, so just potential alcohol of 13.8. The same day, Savoy was at about 20 bricks, which would be a potential alcohol of 11.5. And Wendling was about 70% through Verazon, and we were doing our final fruit drop. So it's our little microclimates are so extraordinary. So, the bottom line is Savoy occupies that sort of midway point. It's not radically cold. It's not radically warm. But for me, it represents this sort of fascinating halfway point between Oregon and California. And I say that because or I should say Oregon and Sonoma County. Sonoma County, we have palm trees, we have citrus. It's very temperate here. Our temperature swings are not radical, especially as you move towards the coast. And as a result, we have this very long growing season. Our bud break here is 6 weeks before Oregon, and yet our harvest dates are a week, 2 weeks ahead of Oregon. And Oregon is much more continental in climate, much like Burgundy, which is why when you look at French investment in Pinot Noir wine space in the United States, the vast majority of it is in Oregon. The Burgundians feel much more comfortable there. It's cold in the winter, it snows, it's warm in the summer, warmer than it is in Sonoma County. And there are many things about it. It's further north latitude, so you get similar sunshine profile in that part of the world. Sonoma is a totally different beast, and I think because of the temperate nature of Sonoma, we tend to have wines of much more silky tannin. Whereas as you move into the Anderson Valley, you get a little more grip to the wines. And if you think about it, if your daytime high temperatures are a little bit higher, you get thicker skins in your Pinot Noir, you have more tannin in the wine, and that's just sort of to be expected. That being said, it's not like Oregon. I mean, you still sense the sunshine and the warmth. It's just, it's this fascinating in-between point for me. And I really love the wines from that part of the world. They have you brought it up, the tension. I love the tension in these wines.
And are these spicy notes that number of us are getting? Is that typical of Anderson Valley, or is that the vintage or the vineyard?
Well, so yeah, I think there's many factors at play. I think I think it's I tend to get those in cooler years where you get better physiological ripeness. Number one, I think it's partly the vineyard. I think part of it is we tend to use in years where we really see nice physiological maturity in the berries, we're using a higher percentage of whole cluster. So this wine was probably a third whole cluster. So you get that spice. There's a lot of stem spice in this wine, I find.
Yes.
I would say that as I go north into Oregon, we use even more whole cluster because we find even more physiological maturity. So that's I think there's multiple underlying causes of that, but I do note it as well.
And Ehren, your Oregon project, clearly I've been looking at our allocations, they're measly. Your wines are selling well or selling out up in Oregon.
Yeah, I mean, I never want to outproduce my ability to sell. I'm a pretty, unlike somebody that grew up in a wine family, I didn't. I've paid for everything I have. And so I'm very, I used to drive the accountants at Turley crazy because I could look at this very large spreadsheet and say, that's wrong. Like, that's not how much wine we're going to sell. And they're like, no, we've got this formula and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, yeah, that's wrong. Here's what we're going to sell. So I have a very strong commercial gene. I think driven by the fact that I'm, heavily in debt to finance this whole thing. And so, for me, the push to Oregon was multi-leveled. Number one, I have my entry-level price point wines, which to me are sort of sacrosanct. I always say, I don't rush out and buy expensive wines from producers I've never heard of, so I don't assume others will. So I have to offer somebody a wine that's at a more reasonable price point that gives a glimpse of what we're doing. And I, increasingly see that as being a difficult proposition in California because the cost of land and grapes just continues to elevate. Not that it's not doing so in Oregon, but Oregon's 30 years behind. So you're able to buy land up there at a fraction of the cost. I bought a ranch in the town of Dallas, which is sort of the southwestern part of the Willamette Valley. Now the new Van Duzer Corridor AVA. And I want to say I paid $8,000 an acre. And in Sonoma County, Russian River Valley, Sonoma Coast AVA, 110 to 150,000 an acre.
Mm.
So, I mean, that's a substantive difference. And I like the wines from Oregon. And my thing is, I mean, it's the eclectic nature of Pinot Noir. I mean, I've bought grapes and made wine from as far south as Santa Barbara and now obviously up into the Willamette Valley. And I sort of enjoy them all. I think they each represent something unique and different. Oregon, in terms of like allocations, I mean, it's still tiny. We don't make that much wine. I mean, it's a 4,000 to 6,000 case operation. Not that that's very, very tiny, but it's tiny enough. I have worked at big wineries where they've enjoyed, crazy critical acclaim and probably could have sold 100% of the wine direct to consumer. And I've always sort of said, yeah, that's a really short-sighted way to go about your business. I think it's important that people in the UK know about my wines, and people in Japan know about my wines, and people in New York. And we commit a relatively large chunk of what we do to the world of to the trade, if you will. We do sell a lot of our wines direct to the end consumer, but sort of in the 60-40 range. We're actively engaged. I mean, as you know, I was in the UK not that long ago. Obviously, the last year and a half or 2 years have caused me to not travel very much. It's a fascinating business. I will say, left to my own devices, I'm a bit of a hermit. And so, although interestingly, you'll have to, we did a dinner when I was in the UK last. It was it's an American woman's restaurant. She's Korean American. Her husband is Greek. I'm blanking on the name of it now.
I think it was called Flat 3.
Flat 3, yeah, that's it. Yeah. So strangely, a very good friend of mine who's an architect who actually is helping me design my winery in Oregon has been working on this project in Greece for years. And I finally made the connection. It's she and her husband's home that they're building on his home island. And he just emailed me this morning and said, hey, she's going to be in Oregon, traipsing around. You got to get together. So anyway, long story, small world of wine.
We've taken up too much of your time, but I'm going to finish with perhaps one question.
Yes.
Looking at the two main regions that you make wine in, Oregon and California, specifically perhaps Sonoma. Which region do you see the most potential over the next few years for specifically Pinot and Chardonnay? I mean, in the UK, we have fallen, perhaps it's more a personal thing, but I've fallen for Oregon Pinot. I've yet to fall for Oregon Chardonnay, but I know there is great Oregon Chardonnay out there, and I'm looking forward to tasting more of it. But with these dry summers, and where are you with this stylistically, perhaps, and potential of the two areas?
Well, I mean, I would say that on some level, I think California has maximized its potential a bit more than Oregon. And I don't say that disparagingly. I think there's so I would go back and say in both states, there is the element of we haven't really been doing it that long. And I think there's massive room for exploration, new development, etc. I think in Oregon, to your point about Pinot and Chardonnay, nobody grew Chardonnay because you could make so much more money growing Pinot Noir. That said, I think it may be a better climate for Chardonnay than Pinot Noir. I think there are some truly electric Chardonnays. Now, granted, there's just not much of them because of the disproportionate amount of the acreage that's devoted to Pinot Noir. That, however, will change. I mean, I think the Pinot Noirs in Oregon are fantastic. Oregon has not had the impact of the drought nearly as much as us. I mean, it's a much more continental climate. It rains there. It actually rained last week. Or 2 weeks ago, we had an inch of rain. We had 3.5 inches of rain in June, which, California, we haven't had 3.5 inches of rain since February, probably. I mean, that was the last meaningful rainstorm we've had here. So Oregon is much wetter in the sense, and so a lot of vineyards are dry farmed, which I think is a really good thing. I think Oregon is probably prepared to sustain, drought better than California with less impact on water. I mean, that said, California is it's like the boom or bust place. 3 years ago, we had flooding in the Russian River Valley, 2018. I mean, like massive flooding. We had 70 inches of rain. And, the last 2 years together haven't put together an average year, which for us is about 35 inches of rain. So it's boom or bust. I mean, I've been here 30 some odd years, and it's always been like that. 3 years of drought and then just torrential downpours. So, is that changing? Wow, that's hard to say. I mean, I lived here for 30 years and didn't see a fire, and there's been catastrophic fires for the last 17, 18, 19, 20. We're early in the season. So I wouldn't say we've had a catastrophic fire. There have certainly been large fires in California, but that happens every year. We haven't had one in our neighborhood, but it's also the early part of September, and most of our fires have been October fires. That tends to be more of the time of the year. So I don't know that we're out of the woods yet, but for friends who have recently moved to this part of the world who just say it's on fire all the time, I'm like, well, but I mean, 5 years ago, for the previous 30, there were no fires. So I don't know. I mean, sure, the last 4 years have been horrendous. But that doesn't mean the spigot didn't turn off and we're not going to see anything for the next 30 years. I don't know that. Opportunity wise, I think there's more opportunity in Oregon. I think there's opportunity in California. It's just I think when you get into the higher price tag for land, you exclude a very large amount of human beings who actually make wine for a living. And what enters in is a category of people who have a lot of wealth accumulated from other professions, who tend to hire people to manage their vineyards and make their wine. And that's fine. That goes on all over the world. I tend to think that when you have that circumstance prevailing, you have less experimentation, you have less interest in deviating from the norm. So I think Oregon has hand over fist more potential. I mean, I think California has the potential. I just think that we're in a space that is, less that way. I mean, my winery's in St. Helena in the Napa Valley. I can think of 5 people that I know that own bricks and mortar wineries in the Napa Valley that actually make wine. 5. There's 600 wineries in the Napa Valley. So that's my point. I make what I want. I don't have to talk to anybody. I don't have to think about it. I just, I'm constantly drinking wines from other parts of the world that's informing my process, my taste, what I think, what I see. But I mean, I'm smart enough to realize, I've made wine for other people for years. And, when it's your job to make someone else happy, that's a totally different space.
Well, Ehren,
so the psychology of the business